Good morning, guys. So I'm going to be going through the lecture for today. You guys are all at different places, meaning by class. So some of you guys, you might want to skip a little bit ahead in this video because you might be a couple of slides in already, whereas other of you, you need the entire set of notes. So let's go ahead and get into the notes. Do not forget that you need to be doing this on Nearpod as well. There will be 2 questions on Nearpod that you need to be able to answer, but there's a lot of information here, so I want to make sure that I had a narration going along with you. Okay, so the title of the notes is Labor and Urban Growth. Now, the previous set of notes said there were 3 reasons for why the second industrial revolution began. It was because of a pro-business government, it was because of new business technology, or new business practices, and then technology is the third. The fourth one is that there is just a mass amount of labor. The labor came from international immigrants. Now, it's going to be mainly Europeans, however, the Chinese are also going to come over in the 1850 time period because of the gold rush. The gold rush did not give many people a lot of resources, meaning very few people got wealthy off the gold rush. So because of that, a lot of the Chinese immigrants are going to work very low-paying jobs, which is mainly on the railroads and in mining materials outside of gold. There is going to be a large hatred towards the Chinese by white people and even other white immigrants, such as the Irish, because the Chinese are going to undercut them a lot of times in their wages. Now, there's a lot of debate about this. There are some sources historically that say that the wage cutting wasn't that big. And in fact, it was just that the Chinese worked so much more intensely hard than the Irish. And then there's other people that say no, the Chinese worked for a lot less money because they weren't having to support families. Most of the Chinese immigrants that came over were single Chinese men. It's difficult to tell because there's definitely bias on both sides. Most of the sources that we have that the Chinese said that they worked hard were from Chinese immigrants themselves. Most of the Irish sources and white sources that we have say that it was because they were just taking such little amount of money. We will not be looking at it too in much detail in this class, but it's an interesting thing in history. Okay, so Europeans that came over, the first set of Europeans that are going to come over that we've really talked about a lot were from Ireland and from Germany. Well, post 1880, most of the immigrants that are going to come over are going to be from Italy and Russia. The major reason why was because of big changes. In Italy, their country became a lot worse. And so Italians were trying to get out. They were going through a massive depression. So Italians are going to come over in big, large numbers. And then Russia is actually going to change a policy to allow people to migrate out of their country. Beforehand, if you were born in Russia, you weren't really allowed to leave. Jewish people are going to want to leave because Russia is not going to treat Jewish people very well. They're going to go to 2 different places. One is to Germany, and the other is to the United States. Both these groups of people, Italians and Russians, are going to move heavily to northern cities, which caused for the populations to explode. If you look down at this chart right here, you'll notice that cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston all like tripled to quadrupled in size in just a span of 40 years. Now, once the immigrants came over, their life was very difficult. They had to work in factory jobs where they made very little money. Italians also had very large families, and so because of that, for Irish, Italians, and Jewish families, most of the time, child labor was very common just because they needed more people to work so that they could feed their own families. They worked in sweatshops, which are just unsafe makeshift factories, and they lived in something called tenements, which you'll probably see that word again, which is incredibly small apartment buildings. Where several families would maybe live in one room. We're talking 12 people to a room, things like that. Now, there was also internal migration. We're going to have 2 big groups of people start to slowly move. The first are going to be black people. Once slavery ends and Reconstruction ends, obviously forces like the KKK, things like that, are going to bring a lot of racism to the South. And so because of that, black people are going to move up to the north. This is not a massive group of people that are moving up to the north that are black. And the reason why is you need money to move. Most black people during this time period worked as sharecroppers, making very little money. And so because of that, the risk of moving was either impossible due to economic reasons, or you would also maybe have to move away from your family and the only support network that you have. For Latinos, this is going to be after the Mexican-American War. So let's go back in time. If you remember, in the Mexican-American War, the United States got a ton of land. Not only did they get all of Texas, but they got the Mexican Cession, which Mexico sold to them, which included California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada. I mean, just a huge, huge piece of land. And there were Mexicans living there during that time period. And all of a sudden, this land went from being Mexican land to being American land. And so a lot of these Latinos are going to start to move to these new cities in Texas and California to work jobs. So they're going to move from rural areas to more urban areas. When immigrants came into the country, it was very different than today. When immigrants come into the United States today, all their immigration processes are done before they arrive to the United States. I guess I should specify and say that this is legal immigration. So immigrants that the United States allows to come in, all their paperwork is filed before they come into the United States. And so when they arrive, they can arrive just by an airport, and then there are immigration centers and airports. During this time period, immigration had two gates. You can think about it. There was a West Coast gate that all immigrants had to be funneled through, and then an East Coast gate. The East Coast gate was called Ellis Island. The West Coast gate was called Angel Island. Most people that came through these islands were allowed in. Ellis Island was a little bit easier to get into, probably because slightly less racism. West Coast, Angel Island, they were maybe a little more harsh because of the Chinese that were coming through there, but both had acceptance rates of over like 90%. Most of the time, you were not accepted if you were a known murderer or a criminal, which was very difficult because it would basically have to be that country telling the other country, like, hey, watch out for this person, they're coming to you. So the most common thing was disease. If you had a disease like tuberculosis or something like that, they'd make you quarantine or send you back home. All right. Now, as these city populations exploded, it's going to radically change cities in America. One of the biggest ways that they're going to change is that there's going to become these immigrant neighborhoods. Now, these immigrant neighborhoods are called ethnic ghettos. This is where other people, it's a neighborhood that has a specific type of one person living in it. So we have nicknames for some of these ethnic ghettos today, such as Chinatown or Little Italy. But there's also going to be big political changes. As people were getting off their boat from arriving from Ellis Island or Angel Island, there would be politicians or representative of politicians standing right there who would offer immigrants a place to stay and potentially a job, or food, but they would have to make sure that they would vote for this politician. So kind of like a cheap bribe. And this allowed for massive corruption in local and city politics. And the biggest example of that is a guy named Boss Tweed, who is right here. And he ran an organization called Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was like his own political ticket. So if you voted Boss Tweed, you would vote the Tammany Hall ticket. So you'd vote for everyone that Boss Tweed told you to. He was a pretty bad politician, but there is some historical defense for him because he was providing some services for immigrants. So immigrants would always vote for him no matter what corruption he found himself in because they felt like he had their back. And the last thing we're going to talk about is citizenship questions. Essentially, this big, long debate that we've had in our country for hundreds of years, which is what is an American exactly? So the question about what is an American really came up during this time period. So 75,000 Mexicans were given citizenship after the Mexican-American War. So if you lived in that section of the country that I just talked about, the Mexican Cession, or Texas, and you were Mexican, you did not have to go back home. You could just be granted American citizenship. But they wanted Mexicans to start to change some of their habits and were not seen as equal. So some of them are going to lose land that Mexicans said that they had that white people are going to come in and take. They had to work pretty bad jobs. A lot of it was hard construction jobs. And then there were laws that were created that stopped some Mexican customs, such as the Sunday laws. This is going to stop things like cockfighting or certain Sunday parades that would go through the town. And these would usually take place on Sunday in Mexican communities, and the United States outlawed them. And then the last thing they passed was something called the greaser laws. This is similar to some of the black codes that were passed during this time, which were things like Mexicans could not be unemployed. For the Chinese racism is probably going to be the worst for all immigrants during this time. As I told you, most of the Chinese that came over were mostly men, and they worked incredibly dangerous railroad jobs. There became groups of people that formed, similar like think of the KKK, called the anti-coolie clubs. These are anti-Chinese groups. The Chinese men are going to be denied the right to vote even after the 15th Amendment. And then there's examples of incredible violence against the Chinese, such as the Rock Springs Massacre, which is where 24 Chinese people were murdered. Ultimately, the United States government is just going to ban the Chinese from coming to the United States with the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is probably the most nativist law that we have in our history, where we target one specific group of people and say they cannot come. And we start that in 1882. And then we don't actually stop it until 1943. And the reason why we stop it in 1943 is because we actually ally with the Chinese in World War II. All right. So that is notes.